Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm your host, Nierenberg. Over the next few months, we'll be airing thoughtful dialogues presented by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and Food Tank. Today's conversation is the second of 7 panel discussions featuring members of the UN Food Systems Champions Network. Each panel focuses on one of the Global Alliance's 7 bold calls to action, which identify critical pathways to create a better future of food. It's my pleasure to co-host this second session with my friend Ruth Richardson, the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and the Chair of the UN Champions Network for the UN Food Systems Summit. Our first panel focused on ensuring an integrated rights-based approach and participatory approach to addressing inequities in the food system, and you can watch it at foodtank.com or listen to it on our podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. Today's panel will focus on the following call to action: increase public research for the public good, supporting ambitious, transdisciplinary, inclusive, and system-based approaches with an emphasis on the indivisible ecological, health, social, and economic goals. Alongside, embrace adaptive learning, diverse evidence such as traditional farmer and indigenous knowledge, and the recognition that holistic understanding of food systems impacts is essential. I am so pleased to introduce our panelists very briefly. It's an honor to introduce Kanayo Nwanze, who is the consultative group on International Agricultural Research Special Representative to the UN Food Systems Summit. He was also previously the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. He has worked in leadership positions for over 40 years in poverty reduction through agriculture, rural development, and research. Thank you so much for being with us. Next, we have Claudia Martínez Zuleta, who serves as co-chair and Colombia representative at the Food and Land Use Coalition and the director of IFPRI. Through her experience in leading research on agriculture, she works to put the fight for equitable agriculture at the forefront. So great to have you with us, Claudia. And last but not least, we have Professor João Bosco Monte, president of the Brazil Africa Institute. He is a recognized leader and advocate for the economic and social development of Brazil and African countries. Thank you so much, João. Ruth, I want to start with you, and I'm wondering if you can really set the scene for us on the calls to action and the UN Food Systems Summit Champions Network.
Great, thank you, Danny. Really pleased to be here with you again for the second webinar, and I'm thrilled to have our roster of our speakers on this topic and to welcome everyone who has tuned in to today's session. Thank you. So on the Global Alliance is a strategic alliance of philanthropies working together and with others to transform food systems. Our vision is food systems that are renewable, healthy, equitable, resilient, diverse, inclusive, and interconnected. On our calls to action, 8 years of research, dialogue, and engagement has resulted in the creation of 7 calls to action, or 7 critical pathways to systems transformation, the second of which we're discussing today, focused on public research for public good. On the UN Food Systems Champions Network, it's fantastic to have members of the network, of which I have the privilege to be chair, join us today to discuss this important issue. In terms of who the champions are, well, the Champions Network is made up of individuals and organizations across sectors and geographies who are champions of food systems and who will contribute to the UN Food Systems Summit by supporting other summit structures like the action tracks, by acting as a sounding board for the recommendations that will be put forward, and importantly, by engaging their networks through hosting independent dialogues and through other means. It's a fantastic group of people, including the folks that we have on the call today. And I'm excited to hear from them about public research for public good. Finally, why is public research for public good important? Well, much of the research undertaken today is outdated and based on sort of a productivist mentality, focused almost singularly on boosting production and productivity, rather than on broader social and environmental food systems issues. This has the potential to undermine the long-term ability of our food systems to do what they're intended to do and what we need them to do. So for research to match the challenges we have today, whether it's COVID, climate change, or hunger, we need to instead focus public research on addressing these complex issues in a holistic and transdisciplinary way. What's more is we need to embrace not just scientific evidence, which is incredibly important, but also diverse evidence such as traditional, farmer, and indigenous knowledge. And finally, we need to ensure that public research has the intent to serve the public good and not other vested interests, and that the funding for this kind of research follows that intent. So hopefully that helps set the stage. Back over to you, Danny.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And I love this discussion. One of the things that I started studying in graduate school was the lack of public research. And so it's so great, to see so many years later that this is finally an issue that so many institutions are taking on, including the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. And we know that research is used to inform policies and can influence political leaders to enact real change. So there's a lot to unpack here and really a lot to talk about. So Dr. Nwanze, I'd like to start with you, and I'm wondering if you can talk about your work with IFAD and how that influences your role as the CGIAR's representative to the UN Food Systems Summit. You're on mute, sir.
Well, thank you. All right, thanks a lot. Well, thank you very much for actually having me on this panel. I think in a sense it's quite coincidental that I am the CGIAR special representative to the UN Food System Summit, and at the same time co-organized with IFAD, where, as you did mention, I spent almost 10 years, 8 of which I was I served as the 5th president of IFAD. Let me look at your questions from this question from the perspective of the significance of research and the role of research with respect to actually I really like the tagline, public research for public good. The food systems transformation to happen, I would believe that everyone must be involved. An all-inclusive partnership from the farming community producing food to the consumers buying and eating it. But the challenges are quite huge. And research, agricultural research, science and innovation are fundamental to bring about agricultural transformation. Now, the challenges are huge, but I believe that the opportunities also make a difference. And this is why the CGIAR's ambitious new 2030 research and innovation strategy aims to transform food, land, and water systems. The CGIAR systems approach puts climate crisis at the center of these efforts, ensuring that the CGIAR research and innovations will be contributing to solutions to agriculture and environmental challenges. And this is why the CGIAR is undertaking some very ambitious, what we call the One CGIAR reform process. And I'm really happy, at least to recall that IFAD, as one of the funders of the CGIAR, does and put a lot of emphasis on research for development, generating technologies, innovation that are basically targeting poor rural people. And I think that is essentially the mission of IFAD is transforming rural lives. And basically, research is fundamental, as I said, is central to that whole purpose. Now, unfortunately, as you have mentioned, research, particularly agricultural research, has received very little attention in the past. And this continues to be the case. And when one thinks about how much, what goes to research, both by the international community and, of course, by the national systems themselves, it is quite woeful. And that is basically also why the CGIAR is engaging on this campaign to actually generate increased funding to agricultural research. And the new strategy, the CGIAR 2030 research strategy on innovation, with science being the basis of it, basically, is one that is going to address this problem squarely. And of course, working with partners. I would like to say very quickly that the CGIAR itself is an incredible partnership system, working across all systems, from research scientists, private sector as well, enterprises, businesses, universities, but more importantly also on the ground with the end users, the smallholder producers that feed the majority of the population in the developing world. Let me stop there and thank you so much.
Of course, and such a great point about the need for working on the ground with those end users. I think that has been something that's often been ignored. Researchers, well-meaning researchers have often taken on research without making it participatory, and I think it's really necessary for the CGIAR and other institutions to make sure that they're including farmers from the very beginning. You've talked about the need for the UN Food System Summit to have very clear milestones, timelines, funding, and commitments for partner engagement for delivery over the next decade. What exactly are you hoping to see, and how can the CGIAR play a central role in helping to see this manifest? And what does that really mean for the future of agricultural research?
The Champions Network and action tracks, in my opinion, will play an important role in helping the UN System Summit to be a people's summit by including diverse voices, particularly the youth, who are our future, and in conversations around transformation, and also by raising awareness of the key issues at stake. As I said earlier, the CGI has a significant role to play in national dialogues, and will be supporting partners in several countries to identify the knowledge gaps. And this in particular, I would like to just quickly emphasize that the CGI is also organizing a series of independent regional dialogues on a range of thematic areas, from water and food systems to gender equality, to gender inequality, and the situation of women in food systems. Transforming food, land, and water systems for the better starts with listening to those who are most impacted, as I said earlier, particularly vulnerable rural communities who need support to withstand growing climate pressures. As food systems champions and advocates, it is up to us to activate our own networks and to ensure that their voices are heard in identifying priorities and devising solutions. And this is, in this respect, I want to again underline that the national and independent dialogues are most relevant. And this is where the CGIAR is actually focusing a lot, to really engage directly with the national dialogues, as well as organizing some international, independent dialogues. For example, what exactly do we mean by this new strategy, on research and innovation? I think this is some. So these dialogues, and of course, because of the reach of the CGIAR, we are present in about 100 countries with our scientists, our researchers, and personnel, and regional and headquarters. Regional centers based in about 70 of these countries where we work.
Great, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the need for including youth and women and other marginalized communities in these conversations, again, from the very beginning. That's so important. Ruth, over to you.
Great, thanks, Danny. And I'm really pleased that Claudia has been able to join us today. With the Champions Network, we have 9 vice chairs that sort of represent different issues. And Claudia is our vice chair for research, so very apropos to this topic. And Claudia, I was just reading this morning that a recent study by Sarah's 2030 Research Collective argues that a global consensus is growing around traditional knowledge and agroecology as principal ways to tackle hunger and climate change. And Dr. Nwanze has just also talked about the important issues of water and gender. The Food and Land Use Coalition that you are with recently published their second FABLE report, which you helped with as co-chair of country teams and also as a representative of Colombia. So my question for you is, how can we better support transdisciplinary research related to climate, food security, agroecology, indigenous knowledge, and other issues in partnership with organizations like Ceres Folu and others?
Thank you, Ruth, and I'm thrilled to be here. This is an amazing sort of panel. Thank you for inviting me. Well, you know that the food systems encompass a broad range of research topics, including ways in which land is used and food is produced, stored, packed, processed, traded, distributed, marketed, and consumed. And when you speak about consumers, you put a broad range of actors there. There are several research and policy documents around the social, political, economic, and environmental systems that are actually influence or are influencing different activities in the food systems. So obviously, when you speak about having all these broad range of actors doing research, for example, around biodiversity loss, climate change, the Apollo sector in general, the state of the oceans, ways to improve sustainable agricultural production, diets, all kinds of approaches to save the planet, we have obviously a lot of research to do. However, it's not integrated. And I think the point here is how to integrate this research and how to make this research valuable to change behaviors, to change practices, to shape the planet's food systems. And we obviously need to understand if these results of these huge, diverse research topics are effectively reaching farmers and consumers. And I think that's the crucial point here, Ruth, because if we don't see new ways and new strategic alliances to sort of bridge the scientific institutions, as my former panel member was just speaking about, universities, but also practitioners. I mean, farmers, indigenous groups, women, youth, chefs, everybody around the world, we cannot transform this. And this is why the Food and Land Use Coalition is sort of reaching out to prove and to transform food system, driving coalitions of change. That is what, for example, we're doing here in Colombia. So that's, to be brief, could go over, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you, Claudia. And I'd love to pick up this question around how much research there is to do and how to integrate it, but maybe we can come back to that later, because you just talked about your research in Colombia, and I'd really like to pick up that piece, just in terms of getting a sense from you kind of on the ground. Can you tell us a little bit about what research is needed, for instance, to help realize the Sustainable Development Goals in Colombia, and how you and others in the country are working at national and subnational levels to support the research that's needed on the ground?
Sure, Ruth. I mean, we're a country, just put the example of Colombia, 50 million people, one of the second richest biodiversity countries in the world. However, we're producing enough food, but we're also importing food from around the world. We have challenges, lots of challenges in sort of food production. We're not very productive. We're using 360 times more pesticides and fertilizers to produce food without producing more. And the cost of that range, for example, is around 30% of the food production. So if you go on and on, we have to shift this to regenerative agriculture. We have obviously to stop deforestation. We're one of the countries that is deforesting more because we're enlarging the agricultural frontier, and that has to stop. But we need to find ways to stop that and to do research that is valuable for the farmers and for everybody that produces food to produce that in a meaningful way. So we're doing the roadmap, the Colombian roadmap, which actually works in territories to produce more food with ecosystem preservation. We want to develop markets, and we want to develop sort of markets for purpose. That purpose is social, environmental, economic purpose that makes sense to the country. We also want to obviously do more healthy diets and to reduce food loss and waste. We only just last year have a new policy on food loss and waste. The country is very aware that this is a huge topic, but we need to implement it. So there is a lot of research to do there and to produce, to come up with results. And we also need to focus on education, innovation, and technological transfer. And that's not an easy approach. That's why we're developing this roadmap and coming back down to the territories where we're working with the governments of the territories, of the departments, with the institutions with the private sector, obviously, with the universities, with the researchers, with the consumers and the producers to develop these transitions to produce, to transform food systems into valuable, powerful engines of growth and development for a country that actually, if you see it, Ruth, only Colombia, the emissions in terms of climate change, 50% come from the food systems. So obviously we need to change. And that's what we're doing in the country, uniting actors, developing these roadmaps in coalitions for change. We're just launching, for example, the roadmap for Antioquia, which is the department that produces more food in Colombia. And we have done that with 180 institutions in the region. And I think that's the way to sort of transform this. We involve youth, we involve farmers, we involve communities, we involve changers. And I think if we don't involve everybody into sort of creating a vision of change, we're going to lose it. So that's what we're doing in the Food and Land Use Coalition and actually doing in practice.
That's fantastic, Claudia. You're doing really interesting and incredibly important work, and there's so much that we could pick up from there. But maybe before we go to some of those questions, Danny, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I love what Claudia said about this vision for change and making sure that research is really viable for farmers. I think that's been a huge problem that, again, I mentioned it before, research has been done that doesn't take the end user into account. So that's really important point. Professor Monte, I'd love to turn to you now. Your work in promoting the relationships between Africa and Brazil has been really widely recognized. And I'm wondering if you can explain why that's important for Brazil and Africa to have these sort of connections.
Thanks, Danny, for the question. And first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be among friends, Kanayo and Claudia and Ruth. When I start to think about Africa almost 12 or 13 years ago, I decided to bring the possibility of engaging Brazil and in the Africa continent. If you look back to Brazil 30 or 40 years ago, you see so many similarities with what you see in the Africa context. If you look back to Brazil again, when we came from a position to import food, and now we are producing enough food for us, but also we can also export to other countries. I understand that we can do things together. We can bring some good practices from Brazil to be deployed, but also customized for the Africa context. It's not just bringing what Brazil is doing and implemented in Africa. We need to see the similarities, but also the singularities that we can have in many African countries. My job as president of the Brazil Africa Institute is to shrink the distance, to have the division that we have, Brazil, Africa, having the Atlantic between us. The idea is to put together the two sides, but also to learn. Usually people say that we can bring answers to Africa, but I can see very pragmatic that we can learn as well from Africa. And this is the mandate that we have at the Brazil Africa Institute, using the South-South and Triangular Cooperation agenda. And I'm very pleased when Kanayo mentioned the 10 years that he spent at IFAD. So congratulations for the job and for the seeds that you put on the ground, my friend. And we can see now the results of the connection. I'll give you an example. We implemented in 2017 the Youth Technical Training Program. And you mentioned, Kanayo, the role or the importance that we have to give, and also Claudia mentioned as well, to the youth. If we do not bring the attention to the young people, we are not able to see results, because we We are not the future. Young people, yes, they are the future. If we involve them in this process, we can see results. And we started with IFAD, the Youth Technical Training Program, and we bring young Africans to Brazil to receive training, but they need to be able to use the skills that they receive in Brazil back home, and we can see results in many areas. I'm a researcher, a professor, but usually when we put 2 or 3 researchers together to talk about results or to find answers, sometimes the answer is not easy to find. And my question is why we should complicate too much our life and people's life. And sometimes the answer is very easy. We need to see how is the need that people have. And this webinar, public research for public good, what kind of public good are we looking for? What is the people that we need to bring results? So the research is important, but we need to see how we can bring answers that are easy for people to use.
That's a wonderful point, and again, something that doesn't get brought up enough. And I love that you mentioned South-to-South information sharing and what Africans can learn from Brazilians. So important. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the unique challenges that researchers face, in the face of political agendas, because sometimes governments have very different thoughts about what should be invested in. And I'm wondering how we can sort of influence policymakers in a way that there is more participatory research, that there is more of this information sharing between countries.
I think that if we wait for the government to bring the answer will not come, because the government changes every 4 or 5 years. Today we have one person seated in one chair trying to resolve the problem, but in 5 years from now, maybe the idea will be different. What we have to do, and I'm very pleased to have this conversation now, is that we can put our hands together to force the government to bring a public policy to be implemented. If the public policy exists, we can go beyond the conversation and we can come to the practical result. I used to say that ideas are very good, ideas are very important, ideas are fundamental, but besides the idea, we have to bring action. So if we have a public policy, and also the private sector, as Kanayo mentioned, the researchers, the civil society, institutions like us and others that we have together in this session are very important to force the government, the present government in any place, you name it, any country, you name it, to bring a solution that can be used, that we can see in the future. I understand that we have to start from some point, and the rural community, vulnerable people, should be the direction that we have to follow, because sometimes we are very busy in our offices bringing the solutions that are not tangible for real people. Who are the real people? We need to see this precisely.
Brilliantly said, that we need to listen to those grassroots organizations and individuals who are doing the work on the ground. Ruth, if you don't mind, we've had some interesting questions from people watching. So Bernie, who is my co-founder on the back end, could you bring up the question about citizen science from Teza, please? So for our listeners, for the people who aren't watching, Teza asked, what about citizen science? How can that create change? And Claudia, maybe you'd like to take that on first.
Sure. I think there is a lot of knowledge in the people. There is a lot of knowledge in the citizens who do a lot of amazing work. There is a lot of knowledge in traditional knowledge, farmers, indigenous communities, etc. So there is a need to bridge sort of the research that for example, CG system does at the top level with very amazing research institutions, with that bottom up, and sort of merge them. We really need to do, farmer field schools. We really need to learn from each other, to go to the field, to do the research in the areas that we need to change. So I would, answer that question by saying that unless we mix and we learned of or what type of research has been effectively in changing sort of mentalities, in changing landscapes. If we go back and look at, what has changed the world, we really think that the world has been changed by citizens who have actively been engaged with others, learning and transforming. And so I think to answer that, we need to do that more. We need to merge and maybe to shift the way we educate children, we educate adults into doing, very amazing research, the way we learn, for example, and go to fields and do this more actively.
Can I come in? Can I just add a couple of things here, Ruth? Because I think, may I?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think I just, what Claudia says, I think it's important for us to understand that the CGIAR is not only just working up there. As I said, actually, the CGIAR is the world's largest public funded institution working for public goods. And I think this is very important. And as I describe the partnerships that the CGIAR fosters with institutions, national institutions, and farmers themselves, consumers, civil society, private sector, everyone has to be involved. And the one CGIAR strategy for about 2030 strategy, as it is called, aims to do exactly that. And because we're basically, CGIAR is a trusted partner with trusted networks of national and regional bodies, whether it's civil society or citizens, as it is called. And when one looks at some of the very impactful results that have come out, for example, there's a recent report that shows that CGIAR's contribution to date have resulted in a 10-fold return on investment, equating to a benefit cost ratio of 10-to-1. And that is based on the impact it has had on the lives and livelihoods of the rural poor, who are our focus. Smallholder farmers is the CGIAR's focus. And we have a campaign that is running during the duration of this year, 2021, exploring innovations that change the world. And let me give you a couple of examples. Developing climate-smart rice and maize varieties grown by farmers. Developing we're pioneering the creation of climate-smart villages and valleys, where smallholder farmers and scientists work hand in hand to develop and pilot climate-resilient technologies and practices. Developing pest-resistant maize crops against the fall armyworm, which some of you know has devastated agricultural systems, particularly in Eastern Africa. And these are part of the products of research, and they are targeted to rural populations. I think it's important that science, yes, cutting-edge science works for the poor, and that is the objective. And I think until we are able to work in very well-organized networks, everyone should be involved, from government to non-government bodies, all the way down towards the smallholder farmer. And until we work with them in such a way that there is an end-to-end activity going on, our results will not be relevant. And this is what the CGIAR has done and continues to do. And I think the emphasis that we're now putting together by having a unified governance structure and increased funding cut across all systems is actually the way to go. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting, but I thought I should add this information to what Claudia just said.
No, absolutely. Just to answer, I'm sorry, Ruth, to interrupt. I totally agree. I mean, the CGIAR is doing a fantastic job sort of reaching down. I was part of C4 and other institutions, and I know how they work. But I think also we need to sort of come up with an educational system to sort of support the youth to do their own research, to come with traditional knowledge type of research, to do more with the citizens that are out there, proving their own sort of transformations in the field.
Danny, I'd love to jump in here if that's okay.
Please.
This has been a really great conversation, and I think that this idea of participatory research is critical, and I'm hearing really strong emphasis on youth and smallholder farmers and women and citizens, which is fantastic. And I completely agree. I'd love to pivot the conversation a little bit, sort of building on that theme around participation to what is the future research agenda? Claudia, you and I have talked about this in the context of the Champions Network and really thinking ahead to 2030, 2050. What is the research agenda we need? I think, Dr. Nwanze, you've talked about crop research, incredibly important. And I think increasingly we're seeing the need to look at sort of more systemic issues. How does climate relate to land, relate to water, relate to the whole system? And, you know, of course, bringing in the political economy as well. What sort of structures do we have in place? What our governance looks like? So just drawing upon that, would love to hear from each of you. What do you think the research agenda of the future looks like? What should we be really situating research around in 10, 15, 20 years? Maybe Dr. Monte, I can start with you.
Yes, when a researcher, a student comes to me with a proposal for a research, my question is, what is this research is about? What is the result that you want to find? What outcomes you think that you see that will be beneficial for people outside, not for yourself, right? So I think we have to have clear the idea that everything that we do, every research that we have implemented or any investment that we do should be able to use in the favor of the people who really needs the result of the research. Sometimes we see so many researchers, so many papers, so many documents that you see very clear that doesn't bring any result, any positive result. So in the investment, if you think about 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, 6 months for a research, it's a very big amount of money that we use to do a research. At the end of the day, the research that we have should be very precise and pragmatic, be able to change people's life. Any little change will be important. If you have a big change, better. But if you do not have any change, is a waste of money, waste of time, and waste of many things. So I think if you are asking in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I don't have a crystal ball, but I understand that we should work now to bring the question very specific. What is the research is about? What kind of result, practical result, this research will bring for real people and for real people who have real needs, right? Again, if we do not think about real needs, there is no way for us to waste our time and the money. So in 20 years from now, if we have the opportunity to talk again in one webinar like this one, maybe we have the answer. In 20 years, what we did. But we need to put this specifically now.
Great. And Claudia, I know that you've been thinking a lot about this. Anything you want to add to that, just in terms of the future research agenda?
Sure, Ruth, and I would like to bring the attention to the public that in the Food System Summits, there are 5 action tracks, and they're actually coming with game-changing solutions to sort of transform food systems. And I think that's crucial, because unless we know what we want to change, we will not be able to come back and understand what will be the research needed to make those solutions happen. So I think it's very important to do those game-changing solutions first to understand what is needed to transform food systems and come back to the research that is needed. Obviously, the topics are so broad, as I mentioned at the beginning of this panel, that we need to sort of focus on the research that will really make a change. And I think there is also a need to do to come up with new methodologies, with new approaches and ways to do research that reach a wider audience and are more effective to ensure transformations. Because, obviously, as João says, unless we focus, we're going to spend a lot of money in doing research that ends up in books instead of in the public goods. And that's where I think we need to change. I remember I was a deputy minister of environment, for example, of Colombia, and we have 5 research institutions in the environmental system. And obviously to focus on what type of research is needed, for example, to save the Amazon, or to save the oceans, or to use the biodiversity. There could be so many range of topics only to do that. That is very important to focus. So I welcome sort of the action tracks, thinking about what is needed. And then, Ruth, maybe we can come back and think what available research is already there that we could sort of answer those questions, and what else is needed. We need to scan what is available right now. We need to integrate the research as well, because most of the time we do research in agriculture, we do research on the environment, we do research on diets, but they're never integrated. So I think the other way to do this is to integrate research and to do more holistic sort of approaches to come up with the research that is needed. And we don't have a lot of money to do that. So we need to focus, and we need to come up with, use accurately the public goods to come up with accurate research.
Great,
Over?
Thank you.
Danny, back to you.
Thanks so much. Sorry about the hiccup there. I want to get back to some of the questions from the audience, because I think they're really building on what you all are saying. So Sharon C. asked, what steps need to be taken to encourage both public / citizen participation in research, and for governments to accept and incorporate citizen-based research and policy measures? I don't know who wants to take that on first. Professor Monte?
I think the universities have so many contributions to bring to this conversation. How many universities we have in the whole country of Brazil, and how many universities we have in Colombia, how many universities we have in many African countries. If you go to the universities, they have already some answers for us to bring to the table. The science, the knowledge that we have, that we produce, should be used for public good. And I like this statement, public good, because at the end of the day, if we do not bring a result, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but we need to focus in this consideration. And the universities are, I think, the source of answers. When we have the universities, and I'm using my head as professor, I can see the potential of a collaboration that we can see with other organizations from the civil society. If we have the job that Kanayo is doing in CGIAR, it's very important, because you have integrated many organizations and scientists to bring solutions. So again, if we go to the centers where the knowledge, the concept is established, we can bring a solution for real problem or real needs. But we need to have the involvement of many organizations. As Claudia mentioned, it's a holistic, and as an environment, we need to respect the needs, but we need to bring the good perspective from all people, all organizations involved. So again, the university is important, but we need to put a combined effort, bringing answers and vision from many parts. It's a question that is not easy to solve. We need to add like a domino. We need to put one, and then when we put all the pieces together, we can see the puzzle, the big picture. But we need to involve all the actors that are possible to include in the conversation.
Such a great point, and it goes back to what Claudia said, that research shouldn't just end up in books or papers. it should be spread, and there, you know, we need to break these silos and include as many people as possible. Ruth, if you're okay with it, I'd like to ask one more question from the audience for now. Hatim Rajal asked, how can research enable institutional environments and / frameworks to work in favor for rural people, especially smallholder farmers?
Are you asking, is that open, an open question?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Okay,
sir.
well, I think this is what I have been saying. I mean, frankly, maybe I should just say very clearly that local issues must be met with locally adopted solutions. And these principles lies at the heart of the CGIAR 2030 Research and Innovation Strategy. And there are some basic questions that this responds to. We're looking at a holistic approach to food systems. And so we're looking at food, land, and water systems holistically as a system that helps us on how to transform and how food gets to the table. Now, there are three things here that I like to emphasize. It must be a science and innovation that gets us to produce better and also better nutritious food. Not just producing better, but better nutritious food. It must be a science and innovation that helps us to transform food, land, and water systems, because they are all integrated and interconnected. And finally, it must be a science and innovation that generates knowledge that helps us build resilience to the climate crisis. We cannot ignore that everything we do today must contribute into strengthening resilience of the rural poor to the climate crisis, and also conserve biodiversity and natural ecosystems. This is, for me, fundamental for us to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think this is the CGI's focus. So if you ask me that an institution, after 50 years, goes through this tremendous transformation of unified governance, of research structure that no longer gets people to work in silos, crop centers, individual crop centers. Crops do not grow in isolation. They grow within agricultural systems. So I think this is, and when you look at the new, I will just tell you what is going to happen is that you're going to have three main science groups. One looking at agricultural transformation, another looking at agricultural food systems, and then genetic innovation. And our scientists, who are our basic assets, are going to be able to maximize and optimize their intellectual capacities, working along these groups to be able to deliver on the ground. And this involves, again, the kind of partnership that the CGIAR has established actually puts it right in the middle of this transformation we're talking about.
Thank you so much. And I love that you mentioned the need for not just more food, but better nutritious food. There's been such an emphasis over the last 60 years on starchy staple crops and filling people up, but not really nourishing them. So I think that's such an important point. Ruth, I'll give it over to you for now.
Great, thanks, Danny. So we've heard a lot about sort of the research agenda. I think there's this point made about how that research needs to sort of get out of books and really fulfill a need, to be focused, et cetera. So the question I'd like to just pose now is, how do we actually make the connection between research and actually communicating and getting the research out? And we know that there's a real mistrust in many places around research and science. So how do we break down those barriers, and how do we utilize the kinds of communications channels we have to really make sure that we're advancing research in the way that Dr. Monte was talking about, in terms of really identifying needs, communicating needs, and being able to fulfill those needs. So just wondering if anybody wants to jump in on this question.
Ruth, I may?
Please, go ahead, yes.
Well, I think there is a lot to do with how we communicate research. Because obviously there is a lot of interesting pieces out there in the world, but we have not been able to communicate them accurately. in the languages that people speak, for example, easy things, no? Or, for example, in easy formats that can be transformed into, for example, guidelines or for practitioners. And I think that's first one point that I would really stress that is needed. The second is how to sort of educate children from the beginning, and in the schools, in the technical institutions, in the universities, to come up with a scientific approach and to understand how to develop their own research. Because that's the other thing. I mean, we have not been able to do accurate educational systems that bring children into the amazing, interesting pathway of researchers. How to think about solutions, how to think about how to save the planet. So I think there is a need also to merge sort of this research agenda that is there out there with the scientists with the educational systems. So communication and education for me are both very important.
Incredibly important, Claudia. And interestingly, the Global Alliance did a sort of a crowdsourced 2050 vision exercise, asking people what their vision of the future of food would be in 2050. And lots of responses came through, and we did an analysis of that. And this piece around education was so strong. I mean, everybody was just saying, we've got to get into schools, we've got to get into primary, elementary, senior schools, and really change the way we educate kids, change the way they're thinking about the issues and the problems. So really appreciate you elevating that. Dr. Monte, Dr. Nwanze, anything from you on sort of the importance of communications and working with media and other channels to get research to the places it needs to be?
I understand your question is very important, Ruth, because if we do not communicate, if we do not let people know about what we do, what result we have, the result will not be recognized as something tangible and important. So after we find any answer, we need to be very precise and smart enough to bring people on board to say, listen, this is what we have, this is what we found. And many times, this is a critical moment that we're facing, because we are investing too much money in research. We should invest more, but the money that we are investing, we have result as book, a paper, but we do not bring to real people what is the possibility of this research to be applied. But I want to bring something else. Before coming to the answer, it's important for us as researchers to knock the door of the real people. And sorry to emphasize in real. Because we live in a real world. So if we go to rural communities, if you ask them what they need, maybe the research that we do in our offices will bring answers for these people. And now, coming back to your answer, when we see the result that is established according to the need, we can come to them, we can publicize and say, listen, this is what we found. And then we can catalyze, we can bring more vision and more possibility for people to be involved in the answer or within the answer that we find. And sometimes we bring a possibility of change people's life, but we do not speak with the people that really needs to have their life changed. So this is a two-way conversation. We need to go there, ask for answer, and then we need to come back to them and say, listen, this is the answer that we find. So communication is crucial and very important. If we do not communication, we cannot see results.
Great, thanks, João. Always bringing us back to the very practical, and really appreciate that. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you so much. I think this has been such an illuminating discussion around not just the need to communicate better, but the need to keep breaking down these silos that have existed for so long, and really make sure that smallholders and researchers are working together, that youth are involved again from the very beginning, as you all have said. I think it's just, these are critical issues at a very critical time. The urgency of what is happening in the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit, I think is greater than ever, and we need these solutions to really come to the forefront and you know, have real change happen. We can't wait another 10 years. We need to make these changes now. Ruth, I'd love to turn to you now for some reflections on the panel.
Absolutely, thanks. And I've been madly scribbling away because there have been so many really fantastic points, and I've tried to kind of organize things, you know, across a couple of different themes that I've really heard today. So the first one is very, very strong. Everyone needs to be involved. I've heard each of you really talk about the need to engage particularly youth, women, smallholder farmers, those that are at the sharp end of a lot of the impacts that we're facing, the consumers, the hungry, you know, the need for citizen science that came through in many of the comments and the questions as well, really strongly. And just want to hold up Claudia's comment. There's a lot of knowledge in the people. Great quote. And so that was, I think, one of the strongest themes I'm hearing is the need for real participatory research with an emphasis and underscore under participatory. The other theme I heard was new strategic alliances. How do we really think about creating alliances between research bodies, between researchers and other food system stakeholders? So it'd be love, you know, in the future to dig a little bit more into what that looks like. But I did hear a number of comments about the need for that. Connected to that, a third theme is really around information sharing, and we heard about South to South. You know, information sharing. We heard about sort of top-down, bottom-up information sharing. I think the main point here being that there is a lot of knowledge held in many different jurisdictions and different communities, and how do we make better connections between those communities and those jurisdictions to learn from each other. So I think that's a really important point. The fourth thing I'm hearing is that we do need more attention, just straight up, on both agricultural research, but also really importantly, food systems research that looks at systems. And as Dr. Nwanze talked about, you know, land, water, food, like the interconnection of these systems. That's a big challenge in a sense, because I don't think that there has been a lot of focus on the systems research and how we actually do that. I think requires a little bit of retraining in our own mental models in terms of how we approach that, the kind of questions we're asking, and the support structures we have in order to be able to do that. Maybe connected to that, I'll just pull up the last comment around education. So, you know, really getting into the education system and helping sort of young people understand systems and the kinds of questions we need to ask and the ways we need to think about those systems and the solutions. The fifth theme I want to bring up is just the kind of research that you guys have pointed to. And some of the words that came up were, Dr. Monte, you talked about real research, you know, what's really needed, and really a focus on sort of priorities. We've talked about research that really goes to specific needs and being very needs-based in terms of what it is we're pulling up in terms of research priorities. Claudia, you talked about the need to focus research. How do we get very specific about, you know, what it is that that we're really putting the focus on? And then, of course, a real challenge: how do we integrate the research? And this came up a number of times. So how do we create kind of integrated approaches and bring together different themes, different modalities, different methodologies, and different issues? Those are sort of some of the main themes I heard. Danny, if I can, I just want to point to a couple of things would be great to flag for future conversation. You know, how do we actually integrate, I think is really important. How do we get this out into the world? You know, the citizen science piece, I think, came up really clearly. So how do we really integrate citizen science? And then finally, I would just point to the investment question. That came up a number of times. We didn't dig into it. It is actually the subject of our next calls to action and the next webinars, but also where does that investment come from? Where does it go to? And how do we increase investment in this very important topic? Back to you.
Thank you so much. That was a great summary, and I really appreciate all of you being with us here today. It's a great honor to have you. And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners. As Ruth said, our next session will be on March 11th on accounting for the positive and negative environmental, social, and health impacts of the food system, a topic Ruth and I have worked on together for a long time now. So I hope you'll join us again on March 11th at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Thanks again to you all. Stay safe, wear your masks, and let us know your comments and suggestions for these events. Thank you.